Good afternoon, everybody. This is Don Vincent. I am the publisher of the Daily Line. I want to welcome you all to our press box event today, recapping last week's City Council meetings. With us today is Alex Nitkin. He's going to be hosting the call with Erin Hegarty from our Daily Line team. And of course, we have WBEZ's Becky Vevea joining us today as our special guest. So thank you thank you all three of you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. We got a lot to talk about, so I won't carry on too long, but I do want to just thank you all for joining us today. This is our third or fourth installment of the press box. We're going to be doing these more frequently and just kind of speaking on topics that are facing the city council, the county board of commissioners, and also some carrying on at some state level stuff as well. So please check back at thedailyline.com to find future events and topics that we're going to be discussing. But as always, the press box is an event where we bring on reporters to talk about the issues at hand. So thank you all for joining us today. And Alex, why don't we kick it over to you and we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, we have a ton to get through today. We have not one, but two city council meetings that we get to recap this month, which is a special treat, you could call it. If you want to hop over to the agenda slide, Don, there are a couple of specific things that we pulled out, starting off with stuff that was approved last week. We want to run through some of the details on them, and we'll get into some of the newer things that are going to be on the horizon and things that we're going to be watching next. First, though, I want to just quickly touch on this brand announcement that the mayor made this morning. I understand that both of you guys, Erin and Becky, were keeping an eye on that. This, I think, is something that Alderman Scott on the west side had been previewing, looking toward, talking. Becky, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that was all about?
Sure. Let me unmute myself. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
So my understanding is that the city is going to be putting they're going to actually sell 250 vacant lots at $1 a piece to an initiative that actually really sprang up from the community, from community organizations and a lot of affordable housing advocates and lenders who work in the community development space. They have a goal of building 1,000 new homes in North Lawndale. The city, like I said they would put 250 lots on the table. They are also, with the help of the aldermen, allocating $5.3 million from the local TIF in that area toward this effort. There's also, my understanding is, state money, about $10 million toward providing essentially $30,000 subsidies for prospective buyers of these homes. And the idea will be to build them in the next 3 to 5 years and really use home ownership as a way to spur development and reinvestment in a neighborhood in the city that's really been neglected for decades and decades and decades. WBEZ reported pre-pandemic and last year about lending in a lot of these communities and how little lending happens. And so this will also, I think, help kind of spur that and then kick that off and hopefully really bring North Lawndale back to being a community full of life and investment.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the lending piece of it. Hopefully we are going to come back to that a little later in this conversation when we talk about some new legislation that was introduced to attack that issue that was unearthed in huge part by that WBEZ City Bureau investigation last year. The mayor also made a little bit of news this morning about these ongoing efforts to honor Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. So we know that now, as of Friday, it is no longer Lakeshore Drive, it is Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable Lakeshore Drive. Leading up to this, the Alderman David Moore and Sophia King and the Black Heroes Matter Coalition have really been pushing for Sable Drive. The mayor was opposed to that, and I feel like this has been sort of covered to death, so maybe we can go through it kind of quickly just to give everyone a sense of exactly what happened. What was this compromise, Erin? How did this come about, and what ended up passing?
So I don't actually know how exactly, the nitty-gritty details of how the compromise came about, but so the compromise is, yeah, Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable Lakeshore Drive, and it's something that the Black Heroes Matter Coalition, which is a group of people who have been calling in and advocating for this name change for months during city council committee meetings. They endorsed the compromise on Thursday, so long as there was a vote on Friday. And Alderman David Moore, after the city council meeting on Friday when this was approved, he said that Mayor Lightfoot played a part in getting this compromise on the table, and she said she advocated for the compromise during her press conference after the meeting. So yeah, that's what it does. It renames Outer Lakeshore Drive Jean-Baptiste Pointe du Sable Lakeshore Drive. I think it'll be interesting to see how the name catches on, how it gets, I don't know, will it be Du Sable Lakeshore Drive? Will it be, DLSD? I don't know. But more after the meeting on Friday, after this was approved, he was pretty, I think he said he was tired, he's tired. This has been almost 2 years, more than a year and a half in the making. And he was pretty emotional that it finally was approved, even though it's modified from his original proposal. Yeah,
I was going to say, starting now on BEZ, we're going to have to listen out for traffic alerts on JBPDS and it's definitely a mouthful, but maybe partially for that reason, not all aldermen were on board. This was I think 33-15 was the final vote, which in another time may have been considered a very close vote, maybe not in this council. We heard that Alderman Brian Hopkins and Brendan Riley, among some others, were making arguments against this name change. What were they getting at, Becky? What were they saying?
Well, my understanding was that it was some concern over a handful of buildings that do sit on the outer Lakeshore Drive. So to clarify, this proposal renames the outer drive, not the inner Lakeshore Drive. And WBEZ will be calling it Du Sable Lakeshore Drive in our traffic reports. I do know that. This morning we put that out or internally, that was sort of okay, this is what we're gonna do. But there were questions about the need to change mailing addresses in these handful of buildings. Hopkins says it's about 6 buildings with a 7th that actually sit on the outer drive that are really kind of downtown when there is only outer Lakeshore. And so, of course, that will cause some need to some rigmarole with the post office, if you will. So I think that was a big thing. But certainly this question of, when you looked at the race of the no votes, 12 of the 15 were white aldermen, and so I think it does really beg this question of was this fight about more than just the naming of a street?
Definitely, and I think that my ears perked up when I was listening in. I wasn't there in person like the two of you were, but some of the aldermen who were promoting this, in particular, heard Carlos Ramirez Rosa saying that, we've seen an indication of white supremacy in the city council itself in terms of their opposition to that. So that racialized aspect of it has definitely been discussed, and it's sort of worth reflecting on, going back to 30 years ago. A sort of similar dynamic played out when a couple of aldermen, including Tony Preckwinkle at the time, tried to rename Lakeshore Drive after Du Sable, and it was voted down mostly by white aldermen. Real quick before we move on, Erin, what did Lightfoot say about her? First of all, could you just talk about what Lightfoot's alternative proposal is that now looks like is going to move forward, and what the mayor said about it this morning?
So yeah, the mayor's alternative proposal renames or names, I guess, the downtown Riverwalk after Du Sable, and I think it's a total of 3 statues that would be, placed around there honoring Du Sable and his wife, Kitty Hawa, and it would kind of link, I guess, the Riverwalk with the Du Sable Park, which has been in the works for a while, and it would also create a Du Sable festival, which is interesting. There's already like a wreath laying ceremony at his bust that happens annually. So that's what's in her proposal. And she said this morning that the details of that plan would be coming shortly, and she expects hearings in July with a potential vote either in July or after the break in August, so in September.
Yeah, it's interesting that this proposal isn't new. She came out with this back in April, and it never seemed to get any traction in the city council, in part because the majority of aldermen, as we saw, wanted to move forward the Lakeshore Drive renaming first. Now that that's out of the way, we'll see if they come back to that. Her proposal involves connecting with DuSable Park, the upcoming, many years in the making, long promised DuSable Park that's going to be outside of the what I still think of as the Chicago Spire site at the where the river meets the lake. DuSable Park is going to be there as well. So before we move on to our next topic here, I just want to make sure everyone knows that we would love for you to ask any questions. If you have any questions that come up, there is a little chat box that you can hit, and anything we didn't hit, we'll try to leave aside 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions so that we can address anything that might still be confusing. Not that there is anything confusing or complicated about the 93-page business recovery ordinance that was passed, most of which was passed in council on Friday. So much of the coverage around this and the attention around this was, I felt like, drawn to the midnight curfew on packaged good liquor sales. It was originally, as proposed, Lightfoot wanted it to be a 10 p.m. cutoff. She said it was a crime and quality of life issue, and then she, after some compromise with business, moved it back to midnight. That was just one small element in a huge rigmarole, to borrow your word, Becky, of other ordinances. There was, I think, 42 pages of this ordinance was just overhauling taxi regulations. Could you, Becky, walk us through some of the other really notable and important provisions of this ordinance that passed last week?
Yeah, so one section, so there was the overhaul of a lot of the taxi stuff. In there was also the legalization of, if folks remember, the tuk-tuk pilot, which is sort of this form of electric low emission vehicle that they would allow those to be legalized, legalizing A-frame sidewalk signs, which I didn't actually even realize were illegal in the city. And then related to that, you've got sidewalk cafes and business signs that are essentially covered under all public way use permits. And it changed the process for public way use permits, which is something I sort of zoned in on when I first read the package. And heard from a few aldermen that it was problematic because it would remove this step in the process that requires the city council to take a full vote on every public way use permit or every small business, any business sign or sidewalk cafe is required to have a city council vote. It ended up being that was that's where the politics came into play. Also, as we saw last week in our Friday fun meeting, there was an interesting maneuver using, as you have in the bullet point, this Rule 17 to essentially isolate out that whole section and deal with it later. So they did not pass it last week. The reason it was something I zoned in on was because it has been this small area of aldermanic prerogative or aldermanic privilege that Lightfoot has long talked about curbing that practice, and this is sort of like an interesting little slice of that. And I think it was an attempt to take, the people who I've talked to in the business community have said, it's kind of silly. Like, why do we need to have a big city council vote for every dang sign? And even there are a lot of aldermen who have said, yeah, this is not, when we talk about aldermanic prerogative, this is really not necessarily the thing that we need to keep control over. But others, I think, saw it as precedent setting, and if they eliminate their power in this small area, would it eliminate their power in other areas? So that was a big thing that I zoned in on. And I think I don't know, I didn't touch on all the other stuff in there, but That was a big
No,
one.
I mean, that's absolutely the one that it turned out to be the major flashpoint in this ordinance. I mean, just a couple of the other things. Yeah, you mentioned A-frames, which were a big deal. I was surprised to learn that those were illegal as well, apparently from the industry folks I talked to, especially after the pandemic started, the ACP, the license department just kind of stopped enforcing that. Interestingly, there was this carve out in the or a sort of rollback of Chicago's party bus crackdown ordinance that would lighten some security regulations on just regular charter buses that have no alcohol on them. That was a big request of the industry. But like you mentioned, Becky, the public way permits, if as all of us who tune in for those transportation committee meetings every month will know, it's not like there's zero deliberation on these ever. This is literally hundreds of listed out addresses, awnings, signs, exterior windows, light fixtures that just get lumped into a giant list, no discussion. They just go up or down vote, they get passed. This has been a huge complaint of the business community, storefront, especially in restaurant bar for a long time. And this is really what aldermen, as Becky, you and BEZ were, I think, among the first to really get on this and preview the fight that was going to come. They were saying, well, we're just not really comfortable with losing this authority, losing this ability. We heard during the license committee meeting when Brendan Riley, downtown alderman, 42nd Ward, seemed like he was really leading the charge against this. He, we're about to talk about Rule 17, but he invoked Rule 36, which is, I think, also important for people to know about. Riley, as the city council president pro tem, has this special ability. He is allowed to just join as a voting member of literally any committee whenever he wants. And he exercised that authority last Thursday, 2 Thursdays ago at the license committee.
Yeah, I think 2 Thursdays, but yeah.
Right, and he said, essentially what this would do, the ordinance as proposed, would give aldermen a 30 or potentially 60-day window to lodge an objection if they want. If they see a restaurant that is about to get a permit, but the alderman, for whatever reason, does not want that to happen, they can lodge an objection. And Rosa Escareno, BACP commissioner, was saying, we will listen to you. We'll absolutely take you seriously. But ultimately, we need to be able to have the power to move that forward so that businesses can get their permits and open. Riley was saying, I trust this business affairs department, I trust this administration, but who knows, like you were saying, Becky, you could set a precedent, maybe years in the future. There could be some other administration that abuses this. And this is really where this line of argument came in that we hear a lot from aldermen. We know best. We know our communities best. We don't trust some bureaucrat down in City Hall to be making these decisions. Riley raised a sort of alternative proposal. He said, well, why can't we just, as soon as aldermen give the sign off without necessarily a city council approval, then the business can open instead of putting it in BACP's hands. Ultimately, it passed out of committee by a pretty wide margin, 15-3, but then it got to the city council, it got to the floor, and that's when Rule 17 happened. Erin, what was that? What happened? How did he do it?
Okay, so thankfully I read through City Council's rules of order and procedure before Friday's meeting after what happened Wednesday. So Rule 17 allows, if there's a measure that's chock full of items, you can separate out a portion of the proposal and vote on them separately. So, ultimately, Alderman Brendan Riley made he moved to separate out the sign permitting section of the Shibe Strong ordinance. Lightfoot's, I think this was when Lightfoot's floor leader, Alderman Michelle Harris, made a motion to block that separation. That failed. And so ultimately aldermen voted, or just, I guess, maybe not discussed, but voted on the measure in 2 parts. And the majority of the ordinance that didn't include the sign permitting section overhaul passed unanimously, 49-0. And so that's what happened. And Lightfoot, after the city council meeting, said they'll continue fighting for businesses. So I don't know if that means, this will come back stronger in July, or what we expect to see next.
Well, I'm actually a little I have to figure this out myself. I'm a little confused about that section. They never actually took a vote then on the separate section. And the vote to separate it out was like divided 26 or 25 to 24. It was super narrow, but we never got to hear a vote on who is okay with or not okay with that section. And that was immediately deferred and it was deferred and published. That was deferred and published by I think it was it Rosana Rodriguez and Lopez. And so these are people who I think are against it, but the question will be like, what is, because it was DMP'd, they have to, I believe they would have to take it up at the next meeting. But the question will be, would it rather be would it make more sense to put it through committee or come up with an alternative proposal that, one thing I think Riley kept asking, and I didn't quite get a clear answer on, was what happens after those 60 days? Like if an alderman just doesn't act, the way it's written, it just then defaults and it's BACP's control and they can decide. Like if an alderman never weighs in. And I think that was also a question of like, well, could we what happens if the clock runs out and there's inaction, then it just goes out of our hands completely, because BACP's argument is, yes, we know you know your wards the best, so you still have this window to approve or deny, but then it comes to us and it never goes back to you.
Yeah, I think that it was deferred and published. It seems like there are sort of two routes that it can go from here. Option A is that it can go sort of the way that Riley wants, which is that there can be a little bit more compromise between these aldermen who object and the administration, and see if they can develop something else, and maybe that will come up in committee again. Or option B, it seems like, is that it'll just, sort of like we saw with DuSable, will just come back according to the regular rules of defer and publish. It just means it comes back in the same form the next meeting. And I think that there could be a reason to believe, or Lightfoot could have reason to be confident, that it will pass under those circumstances anyway. This was a really 25 to 24 vote. If whichever alderman was absent were present, was it Derek Curtis? They could have voted against it and it would have tied and failed. So one thing that I noticed is that there was at least one alderman, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Alderman Ramirez-Rosa said that he supported the permit overhaul. He supported that provision of the ordinance, but he also supported taking it out to consider it independently. So on a 25 to 24 vote, that's all you need. So maybe the mayor thinks that she has enough votes to move forward on her own. That's something that we're gonna have to watch. But we also know that some aldermen are really in favor of giving this permission to putting it more directly in BACP's hands. We have Tom Tunney, who, as he often likes to remind us, is a business owner, is a restaurant owner, is very much in support of that. So is Michelle Smith, the chair of the Ethics and Government Oversight Committee. And I noticed that in Scott Waguespack's newsletter on Friday, of course, very close ally with the mayor, Finance Committee chair, said, this is really critical, in part because we've seen aldermen abuse this power. Not long ago, we saw an alderman, Ed Burke, indicted over this wasn't exactly a public way permit, but trying to hold up a driveway permit in order to solicit private business. So there's a real ethics argument to be made. Before we move on, should just note also, I think Fran Spielman at the Sun-Times was the first to point this out. This was the first vote that the mayor has lost on the floor of the city council, as far as I can remember. I mean, there have been other votes that, seemed like they were gonna fail, and so she pulled them off. I think this was notable for that reason, and obviously also a big setback or defeat, if you want to call it that, for her long-running sort of stutter-start campaign to remove aldermanic prerogative overall over local decisions. The big sort of end goal that she had spoken of doing is removing aldermanic prerogative from zoning decisions, but it seems like that is very remote at this point. I mean, that is a pretty key power for aldermen to be able to have, right, Becky?
Mm-hmm. Well, right, and I think that is a good point. And I will say, when I was reporting it, when I first read through the package, I talked to Alderman Riley. I talked to Ramirez Rosa. You know, I actually wouldn't be surprised if he ultimately voted against it, because he said, you know, and it's been interesting because you see these interesting coalitions starting to emerge. You know, Lightfoot has always said she kind of governs to 26, and she has so far not lost any votes on the floor like this. She's always managed to get in the high 20s, 30s, you know, for her stuff. But what this aldermanic prerogative issue is, I think, could do, and in the wake of the last 2 years in which there's been some tussles between her and different factions, but you've got sort of the Democratic Socialist arm, the ultra progressive arm of the council, who's not really, you know, supporting a lot of her stuff right now. And then you've got sort of an old guard that really believes in keeping aldermanic prerogative in place. And then you've got her, you know, you've got her supporters, the committee chairs and others, but even some of them, you know, I think her former floor leader, Villegas, you know, voted, I think he voted against, I think he did vote to like split this out. And so
you quoted him in your story saying, hey, this is too big.
Right, and I did talk to him about the whole package, because he also was like, it's a great package. There's a lot of great pro-business things. He's a very pro-business guy like Riley, but he was like, it's so big, and this particular sign issue starts to, it's not the heart of aldermanic prerogative, that's zoning, but it is enough of it to like chip away at this thing that, you know, I think is a question for Lightfoot. I wonder about, was it giving just enough fuel to get just enough votes, like of people to team up, you know, and lose that 26? Like, has she fallen to that border? Has she lost some folks? And we'll see, I guess, come budget season, because, you know, depends on, you know, how many people feel strongly enough about like blocking some of her stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, the budget is always the most critical vote, and it's when it's going to be the biggest test. And I think we're going to talk a little more about that a little later in the conversation, especially since they're going to be talking this year about American Rescue Plan funds and how to fold that in. I'm old enough to remember 3 years ago when 42-8 was considered a close vote in the city council. Those days are over.
I remember covering like a no vote.
Yeah.
Like, whoa,
big
there's
news.
a no vote. One no vote.
Yeah, different times. On that note, speaking of division within the city council, I want to touch on civilian police oversight. This is something that very notably did not, in a climactic way, did not get done this month, even though we were all expecting it to. I just want to try and give a quick setup here. This was a 100-day promise of the mayor. Within 100 days, she was going to enact some kind of civilian police oversight. She supported the GAPA civilian police oversight plan, which actually grew out of the the Police Accountability Task Force that she had headed for Rahm Emanuel back in 2016. She had supported that, and it seemed like it might have been about to pass back in March 2020 until it derailed at the 11th hour over this disagreement over who would have the final authority over policymaking decisions for the police department. GAPA wanted the Civilian Commission to have the final decision. Lightfoot wanted the mayor's office to have that decision. She eventually broke off, said, I'm going to come up with my own ordinance. And then at the same time, you had this other more radical coalition coalescing around this alternative CPAC proposal, Civilian Police Accountability Council, that was a little more powerful, more direct democracy, which would be a directly elected commission, as opposed to GAPA has a little bit more of an indirect, more Byzantine system where you have these district councils that are electing a nominating council that are electing the actual oversight council. And so for the longest time, for like a year, basically, we were in this holding pattern. We had CPAC over here and GAPA and the mayor's theoretical other proposal that would keep that final policymaking authority in her office. None of them had enough support on their own. And we started to finally see things get going in, I want to say February or March this year, when CPAC and GAPA announced that they were forming a coalition and combining to create the ECPS, Empowering Communities for Public Safety Ordinance, which basically looked a lot like the less radical GAPA proposal, except it had this really critical provision in it that would trigger a voter referendum that would go to Chicago voters and say, well, voters, which system do you prefer? Do you want GAPA or do you want CPAC? And so this new ECPS proposal we saw over the course of the spring really gained, snowball support among the city council. Of the three major, the progressive, Black, and Latino caucuses all eventually endorsed it. And this, I think, put some pressure on the mayor to finally introduce her own version, which happened last month. And it set up this kind of like high noon showdown this month, where in Public Safety Committee, the chairman, Chris Taliaferro, had been promising this for months and months. We're going to put the mayor's proposal and ECPS, the grassroots proposal, right up alongside each other. We're going to see which one gets to 10 votes in the 19-member Public Safety Committee. And it seemed right up until the vote that the ECPS coalition was pretty confident that they were going to get their vote over the top. What led them to think that, Erin? What were you hearing leading up to that, and what ended up happening there?
So yeah, in the couple days leading up to that meeting, I guess two Fridays ago now, proponents aldermanic sponsors of the ECPS ordinance said that they were talking with people who might kind of be on the fence between supporting ECPS or not. And one of the main sticking points for people who are on the fence was the referendum component, because that would essentially morph the GAPA-like proposal into CPAC. And I talking to some people, they told me that they couldn't vote for ECPS because of that, and they also couldn't vote for the mayor's proposal. So kind of in a, last minute move, ECPS stripped the ordinance, or stripped the referendum component from their proposal, and that was what they wanted to have considered on Friday, and they tried to get that version of the proposal accepted into committee so that aldermen could discuss and vote on it. But essentially, Chairman Taliaferro said it's too close to, you've tried to submit this new proposal too close to when we're talking about it. It's, I got this at 9 or 9:30 a.m. The meeting's at 10. We're going to consider, or basically, I think a few votes happened, and Taliaferro said he was going to move forward with taking a vote on the ECPS ordinance as it stood, with the referendum question attached to it, which everyone kind of could guess would not get enough votes to pass out of committee at that same time. I guess he said he was getting, a message from the mayor's intergovernmental affairs saying that they wanted to pull Lightfoot's ordinance from consideration that Friday. So the meeting ended, and we did not, or aldermen did not pass a proposal out of committee that day, which
another extremely close vote, right? Was it 10-9 for tabling the motion to accept the new substitute ordinance?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was super close, and I think there was even some moves to change votes after aldermen had voted, and I think it was a very, very close vote. And that was another instance where Alderman Brendan Riley used his privilege to
36
during that committee. So I think that came the day after he did that in license. So that was interesting to see.
Yeah, it's a little hard to remember because this was now the Friday before last. This is 3 parliamentary fracases ago. But it barely failed. So that gets tabled. It's, I think, really important to point out, as you mentioned, that the mayor did not bring up her alternative proposal for a vote. And all of the proponents of ECPS pointed to that and said, well, obviously, she just doesn't have support for it. They have also pointed out that there are, and as far as I know, still 0 aldermen who are still fully on record in support of the mayor's proposal on this. Even Taliaferro, who had been quoted in a press release when the mayor came out with this proposal last month, supporting it, has since sort of walked that back and said, well, I don't really know which one I'm going to support. I'll have to see both arguments. And another really critical thing that you mentioned there is that there are a number of folks in this committee who, as we know, is overrepresented by people who represent a lot of police officers. Those sort of like outer, bungalow belt wards. And we've heard from folks like, Nick Spizzato in the 30th ward, who represents Dunning and Portage Park, on the committee, saying, we don't need either of these. He sent us over a list of all of the other oversight bodies that, we have the police board, and we have COPA, and we have, they wear body cameras already, and we have the IG's office, the Inspector General, which I think is also folks that I've heard who are involved in just trying to make this legislation happen. A huge part of just what makes it so difficult to put this together is that you have to weave this new commission into this like tapestry of oversight that is already there. And it's just a lot of legal questions, bring in an election. And so, yeah, we had heard that referendum provision was seen by some as sort of a poison pill. And now that that's out, we'll see if it goes anywhere. But we talked about Rule 17. We talked to split the ordinance. We talked about Rule 36 for Riley to join any committee. We should talk about Rule 41, because that is what proponents of the ECPS coalition have used to make sure that comes up. Or am I misremembering how that?
There was a Rule 41 filed by Andre Vasquez to hear, but I think it was to actually hear CPAC on the floor, and he withdrew it at the end of the meeting on Friday night at 6 p.m. because it was Friday night and 6 p.m. But he did say at the mic, he said, I urge us to actually finally have a real debate and not a committee shenanigans kind of debate about civilian oversight of police. And, I'm old enough to remember when there was IPRA, and IPRA was then replaced by COPA. And yes, you have the police board alongside of COPA. And then, I think there are questions about the consent decree and how does any of this fit in with that. But there is certainly a lot of political movement and motion toward getting more meaningful civilian oversight of police, and it will be interesting to see if ECPS, the substitute ECPS, actually, if there's a way to like Rule 41. I don't know enough about like if there would be a way for them to introduce that or to direct introduce that, given that the original was voted down in committee.
Yeah, and Rule 41.
They'd have to refile it probably and get a new ordinance number.
Yeah, it's definitely possible, and we'll have to see how that goes. We should point out also that in the new introductions, among the new ordinances that were introduced was a proposal by Carlos Ramirez-Rosa, one of the biggest ECPS leaders, sponsors, to get that referendum on the ballot independently. That was one of those things that it seemed like it was maybe going to get sent to Rules Committee, but then he directed it to Rules Committee on purpose, because I guess that's where it belongs. So also we'll have to see what happens there, but we know there's a lot of resistance by aldermen to that.
In Lightfoot's press conference, just one last note, on Friday, she said that she sort of saw all of this as like a backdoor way of a backdoor proposal to defund the police. So that was also pretty strong words from her. And so we'll see where ECPS goes from here, I guess, given that.
Yeah, it's definitely not going away anytime soon. The over the past year and a half, the coalition supporting it has gotten very, very restive, and we've seen folks who are usually on the mayor's side about a lot of things, like Harry Osterman, be very critical of her on this, because he was also an original sponsor of GAPA. Yeah, also wanted to point out, yeah, you mentioned IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority, that was replaced by COPA in 2017. That was one of the other recommendations of that Police Accountability Task Force that Lightfoot was part of. Get rid of IPRA and install a Civilian Police Oversight Commission. They have done one. They have not seemed to be able to do the other yet, but we are going to be watching. Okay, let's move on to, it's a lot of stuff. Maybe we can just sort of, run through it. Oh man, I'll make this sort of a jump ball. Who wants to talk about what happened? We should bring this up. What happened on Wednesday to, why did we have two meetings, and what was going on with the appointment of Celia Mesa?
Yeah, so Celia Mesa is the person that's been appointed. She's been serving as interim, but she's the person who appointed to be the next corporation counsel. And her committee hearing, got a lot of questions about the law department's handling of the Anjanette Young case. And yet it still passed out of committee. And there were, like I said, a lot of other routine appointments. So it was like the second item called on Wednesday, thinking, okay, it's an appointment of the mayor, it should sail through. Well, Ray Lopez and Jeanette Taylor basically moved to defer and publish this item because they're very upset by the handling of the Anjanette Young case and the city sort of now, I guess, fighting with her lawyers as to whether or not to settle. And, Jeanette Taylor had a lot of strong words saying that it's kind of horrible and disrespectful of the city to say one thing publicly about how wrong it was to raid this woman's home, and then to fight her in court. And so they kept saying, it was never about Celia Meza herself, but that it was about this issue over the Anjanette Young case. But that is what led us to having a Friday afternoon evening meeting. Yeah, I think there's still, again, a lot of political disagreement and some bad blood between the mayor and people on the city council floor that it's gonna start to heat its head even on these items that nobody sees coming as being controversial. So, but ultimately she has been appointed. She's the first Latina woman to hold that job. She has worked in private practice, but she's also worked at the city for many years. I was struck by Mara George. I am going to screw up the way to pronounce her name, but the longest serving corporation counsel from the Daley years. Knew Celia when she was a young lawyer in the department, and she came and stayed for the whole meeting on Friday to support that appointment. So, yeah, that's a little recap of a bit about what that was all about.
Yeah, and then they came back. That's why they had to do the 48-hour. Another interesting thing we should point out that the reason why this meeting was 48 hours after the original one is because all defer and publish doesn't mean that something has to wait until next month. It means it has to wait until the next city council meeting. But the next city council meeting can't be scheduled more than 48 hours in advance because of the Open Meetings Act. So if you ever wonder why there's that 48-hour break between those two, that's why. One substantive thing did happen on Wednesday. Also a little bit of history made. The city council appointed Annette Nance-Holt, the first female commissioner of the Chicago Fire Department, first Black woman commissioner of the Chicago Fire Department. And that occupied a lot of time during what's typical, the sort of like honorary speeches at the early part of the city council meeting, a lot of aldermen giving praise to that appointment. I guess I just want to sort of quickly run through the rest of these we have listed there, unless there's anything that you guys want to speak up on in particular. We saw this really striking and frankly kind of hard to read, the details of this settlement. Chicago Fire Department, 5 women who were not identified brought allegations of some pretty egregious sexual harassment against supervisors who were, they were paramedics. It's interesting that this lawsuit was filed in the beginning of 2018, and all of the allegations in this, most of the allegations surfaced in this complaint date back to like mid to late 2017, which tells us like, not necessarily that's when they started happening, but it was really timed to that Me Too moment. And I think that we're going to be maybe having to watch for, knowing that the pace of litigation and the way that it moves, more of this kind of, potentially complaints coming up through the system or coming to our attention. So that was approved. We should mention the sort of companion ordinance to the Shy Biz Strong Business Relief package that also passed last week. This was the sort of labor piece. This was a lot less controversial than the business piece. This expanded the city's paid family leave policy to include, I think, non-familiar relations and more just sort of guardian or if you're taking care of someone with a disability. It also put in some pretty hardened wage theft provisions to really create an enforcement mechanism within the city's Office of Labor Standards to crack down on wage theft. I'm just going to keep through these, but please jump in, you guys, if there's anything that you want to note about any of these. This one was really interesting because this is the Hotel Right to Return to Work ordinance was proposed by Unite Here, which is a pretty major hospitality workers union here in Chicago, local one, proposed an ordinance to require hotel owners to consider hiring the last people who were laid off first. This is, a pretty typical sort of pro-labor, fairness thing. They want the hotels to do right by the people who were laid off. In some cases, who had been working at these hotels for decades. The hotel industry, and particularly the Illinois Hotel and Lodging Association, really opposed this, saying that it was basically its provisions were too strict, that it was going to, in effect, tie the hands of rehiring and reopening because of how tightly regulated that. Ultimately, the two groups reached a sort of middle ground. Unite Here and the Lodging Association agreed on a compromise, and they passed it, and we had a little ordinance bill signing. Right?
Friday night they had a little signing of this.
It's interesting that they chose of everything that passed, I thought, to put a little bit of pageantry around that, maybe because, it's just a good opportunity to grab onto, business and labor agreeing on something, getting along, sort of makes everyone look good. The Urban Forestry Board, this is something, Erin, that you had been covering, that was approved. This is going to be an advisory body to advise the city's forestry program, which is in the Department of Streets and Sanitation. The city is losing its tree canopy every year, which is something that Erin's been reporting on. And we're definitely going to be following that and seeing what the Urban Forestry Board actually does and recommends. And then a lot of tax increment financing disbursements. This is the kind of stuff that can fly by really quickly, but it's millions, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars, including there was one, Becky, that you covered and noted some details of in Garfield Park. Was it like $10 million?
Yeah, it's almost $10 million of TIF money that's going to go toward fixing up a lot of Garfield Park, their field house, they call it the powerhouse, the old sort of water courts, and yeah, there was a whole, in all, it was like $17 million in allocations to different parks around the city, including some North Lakefront, sort of North Branch Riverfront parks, kind of around Northside College Prep. There's some parks getting improvements up there. But Garfield Park, yeah, it's going to get like 9.6 million, I believe. But again, it's TIF money, and there are many arguments of TIF, around that say, the TIF money should be going towards our public goods like parks and schools. So it was, nice to see the allocations on the agenda, and it'll be interesting to see. I'm always kind of interested when I see those come up because, the park district and the other sister agencies only have so much money to do all the capital improvements they want to do. So they often turn to these sort of city funds and city accounts to help supplement improvements and infrastructure.
Yes, I mean, we're going to have a whole other event just to talk about tax increment financing and why it's controversial, but I think it's definitely worth pointing out that these ones in particular were so uncontroversial because they were explicitly going toward public spaces and public goods. Anytime a vote is coming up for TIF to be used on, a private business, there tend to be some more questions around it, or say, a $6 billion neighborhood, there are some questions around it. That's what happened with Lincoln Yards. So in the time we have left, and I do want to get to some of the questions that I've seen come in, but first let's just touch on some of the new things that came up that we're going to be watching. Howard Brookins, who is the Transportation Committee Chair, introduced a proposal to create a permanent citywide network of e-scooters. There have been 2 pilots now on this, pilot programs to spread scooters around the city. The most recent one ended last December, and we had a city council subject matter hearing in the transportation committee to talk about it. There was a whole range of opinions that aldermen had. Some were pretty okay with them. Brookins, the chair, seemed to be on board with them. Others were pretty hostile to them, said that they're ending up everywhere, they're getting scattered, they're a problem for us to deal with. And so Brookins introduced this new permanent proposal on behalf of the administration. CDOT is the Department of Transportation is really moving forward and saying, we want a mobility, no carbon, micro mobility option. And this was sent to the Rules Committee by, I believe, Raymond Lopez, who was among that contingent of Southside aldermen saying, like, we don't want these things, they're a mess, they create problems for us. And we are going to have to watch to see what happens with that. And I think that the mayor actually chimed in on this, right? The other day?
Yeah, she said the proposal essentially did come from CDOT, which you could kind of maybe assume that she's on board with this, but yeah, she said the city needs to offer residents, a carbon neutral option for getting around. And I don't know, she didn't say whether she likes scooters necessarily, but pointed out that some people love them and some people absolutely do not, are not fans of scooters.
This is the next great divisive issue. Okay, I do want to spend a minute talking about this proposal for a new city council independent council. This is a new law office or attorney that would independently represent the city council as opposed to the corporation council, now Celia Mesa, who we talked about, who represents the whole city writ large. Erin, could you set this up a little bit for us and talk about where this idea came from and what happened, or what this new proposal is?
Yeah, so most recently on Friday, Alderman Beal and Alderman Hopkins introduced introduced a proposal. So kind of not in the typical order that you would introduce something, introduce this proposal to establish, independent legal counsel for the city council, who would also serve as the parliamentarian for city council, not necessarily, it would be separate. And there's kind of some confusion around that introduction. Alderman Beal initially said he wanted the aldermen to take action or vote on the proposal that day. Hopkins said that wasn't necessarily the intention, and Alderman Beal agreed to have the proposal referred to the Rules Committee. But this isn't the first time this year that it's come up, because Alderman Jason Irvin in, I think it was February or March, introduced a resolution calling for a hearing on creating independent legal counsel for the city council. And it hasn't come up yet. It hasn't been heard in the Rules Committee, but it is something that Mayor Lightfoot campaigned on as supporting, and she reconfirmed on Friday that it is still something she supports. And she even said that she thought they had already gotten independent counsel. I don't know necessarily how you could be confused about that, but yeah, I'm interested to see what happens, because at the same time, I think Alder people, Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez and Alderwoman Hairston introduced a measure asking corporation counsel to submit to city council an opinion on establishing independent counsel for the city council, and what challenges could be to having someone making these procedural decisions for council separate from corporation council.
So sort of dual tracks of trying to make this happen. It seems like it's definitely on the way to happening, especially with the mayor behind it. And I think it's also important to put this in context with that friction that we've been talking about between the city council and the law department. I remember, going back to the Angela Young incident and the law department's handling of it. You guys may remember in December when we had this 8-hour hearing about the law department practices. I think it was Beal who raised this issue when, all the time during committee meetings, aldermen will go to Jeff Levine, the assistant corporation counsel, or whoever in the law office, and ask them to sort of call parliamentary balls and strikes. And Beal said, well, wait a minute, they're not an impartial party here because we're talking about them. We need some kind of independent referee here. So that's, I think, where this springs out of. So we have a couple other things, but I want to make sure that we get to these questions because I think we should keep to our 1 hour shot clock here. So I want to start off with a question about Lakeshore Drive here. What plans are incorporated into the proposal to rename Lakeshore Drive and or the mayor's proposal to honor DeSable's wife, who, according to Alderman Hopkins' telling, was somewhat like the Sacagawea of Chicago? Incredibly excited about the renaming of Lakeshore Drive, but not incorporating DeSable's wife into the recognition somehow seems like a possible miss. I will note that it seems like in Lightfoot's proposal, she's made pains to take to mention Kitty Howa, his wife, and that she would be involved in the sort of Riverwalk part of it. Is that right?
Yeah, and she's frequently refers to them as like Chicago's first family. But yeah, my understanding is that her park proposal and Riverwalk proposal would include honoring Kitty Howa and honoring like them as a family, and as well as some, like, I think educational components to the schools, which children would like understand and learn about both of their contributions to creating Chicago.
Yeah, and I think that there's some very important symbolism here that people have latched onto about the importance of honoring both the like early, Black influence and Indigenous influence and Black culture and Indigenous culture that are really at the heart of Chicago's origins in a lot of ways. So I think that is important in a symbolic way too. The next question, okay, this is a nice, very deep question. There appear to be shifting coalitions based on various issues. Does this indicate the emergence of a true legislative body, or is it simply signs of a council out of control? This is something that comes out a lot in the annual, if any of us who read the Dick Simpson rubber stamp reports, the former alderman, sort of reformer independent alderman who would criticize the like rubber stamp council. The question is it really is it a good thing that it's now the opposite, more, some would call it chaotic. Certainly at times it was chaotic, as we saw last week, but it's also, you could call it more deliberative. Becky, what do you think?
Well, I will say, I think that it is, I do think it's a sign that it is more of a legislative branch than it's ever been or has been in a long, long, long time. Chicago on paper, our government on paper really actually is set up to be a strong council, not necessarily a strong mayor-weak council setup. And so to see the council taking, like growing into that role or taking a charge of that power is really fascinating. And I do think that what we're seeing right now is it's not totally predictable who, like I said, you had socialists alongside like longtime the Ed Burkes of the world voting on the same thing and in opposition to the mayor. Now I think the question is, I wouldn't say it's like dysfunctional or chaotic. And it's also not partisan in the same way that like Congress can be partisan, where it's just divided and every, the pendulum swings Republican or Democrat every, 4 years. It's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think the question is it conflict for conflict's sake and for the next election? Because one thing I also heard about the business package was like, oh, this is a package where you can look at someone's no vote and then put it on a flyer that they voted against. They voted against making something easier for businesses in 2 years when they're up for re-election. And so if it's about the politics and the re-election, then it becomes chaotic, and I think a little bit, I become cynical. But if it's actually about good policy, like civilian accountability of police, like having that discussion out in public with actual written drafts changing in real time, invisible ways for the public, I find that to be like refreshing compared to trying to figure out how proposals changed.
All the conversations happening behind closed
you know,
doors.
like
Yeah.
it used to be that the proposal would change in the back room 16 times, but all you saw was number 1 and number 17.
Yeah.
You know, like the public only got to really see the beginning and the substitute that Rahm or Daley or whatever put forward being as the solution. You didn't really get to see the back and forth and the true compromise. So I think it'll depend on the issue. Is it conflict for conflict's sake, or is it conflict for creating better policy? You know?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Before we end, Erin, any last word that you want to have on that question? Whether it seems like it, you know, a true legislative body versus chaos it's a tricky needle to thread.
I don't know. I just, you know, last week was my first time covering city council, being in council chambers, watching everything kind of unfold real time. And like, I don't know, I can't say it's refreshing, like Becky said, to see all of this stuff kind of happen in real time, but like it's interesting. And I think it's like to listen to a roll call vote and hear like certain groups of aldermen all vote no on something and know that they probably disagree on so many things, but just to think about how they both, or no, you know, how each party got to this no vote, they probably got there in different ways, but
Just having roll calls are fun. Like when I first started covering council, you had one roll call and you applied it to every item for the rest of the meeting. Right. Like the best tape you got was the clerk saying, you know, this item passes, like she's an auctioneer, you know, like, and now we actually have roll calls on different items and you can see where people stand.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point also, Becky, that you raised about the city council being so different, and I would argue in some ways more interesting than Congress, because it is so much more three-dimensional. You have these all kinds of different coalitions that can form. You saw, you know, we just said earlier, Rossana Rodriguez Sanchez and Raymond Lopez teaming up to defer and publish that business relief package. There's a lot of stuff those two aldermen do not agree on. Or, you know, you could say the same thing about Lopez and Taylor DNPing Mesa's appointment the other day. There are just so many different, you know, vectors of ideology and self-interest and constituencies that we're always going to continue to see these very different coalitions come together based on interest. And so we hope that you continue to stay with us and watch us and read our coverage so that we can help you understand it. And we hope that this event in this past hour have been helpful to, you know, bring that to light a little bit, even though there's a lot that we didn't get to. We didn't even talk about the budget of the American Rescue Plan. That'll have to be next time, or you can keep reading as we continue to cover that. Yeah, thank you for coming and watching, and we hope that if you don't already subscribe, you can look into some of our membership options so you can get what we're reading every day. Listen to BEZ. I wanted to put in a plug for Reset's Reimagine Chicago project, also talking about you know, explaining how the city council works and how it could be different. That's relevant to what we're talking about too. Yeah, thank you, and with that, I'll kick it back to Don. You're muted. Oh, you're muted, Don.
Yep.
That's important. Well, hey, I just wanted to say thank you to the three of you. This was a really great conversation, and I hope everybody who has joined us today found it useful and informative. I know I sure did. So, Becky, thank you so much again for joining us today. Erin, Alex, as always, great job. For all of you out there still listening, check back in July. The Chicago Index will be publishing mid-July our results on the most recent Q2 index that we had put out with our partner Cranes on this endeavor. So please check back for there. We should have some more press box events coming up soon. And as Alex said, if you are not subscribing, visit thedailyline.com. There are a number of ways to become a member, or certainly just sign up for our free review newsletter that gets you access to a bunch of this fun and free content. Alrighty, guys, enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.